Okay, this will be a TOK presentation on the Watergate scandal. A little background information on what Watergate was. It was a political scandal that occurred in the 1970s. President Richard Nixon's committee for the re-election of the president was directly linked to the funding of break-ins and the Democratic National Headquarters. Wiretaps were placed in the offices of high-ranking officials, Democratic officials, and Nixon directly approved a cover-up of the scandal, and the FBI investigation of the break-ins was stalled until the re-election vote. Meanwhile, the public were oblivious to what was going on. Knowledge question. Nixon won the re-election and became president. This sparked thought because the public were not fully informed about the actions of Nixon. Therefore, my knowledge issue is, was it ethical for Nixon to hide information from the public? This led me to my main knowledge question, which is, how does the gain of shared knowledge affect personal knowledge? Unpacking the knowledge question. Before we can investigate, we must unpack the knowledge question. What is shared knowledge? Shared knowledge is knowledge assembled by a group. What is personal knowledge? Personal knowledge is knowledge gained through first-hand experience or observation. The ways of knowing that will be explored are reason and faith. Reason affects personal knowledge because it is used to build and evaluate our knowledge, depending on whether we subconsciously use inductive or deductive reasoning, will decide the certainty of the conclusion. Faith affects personal knowledge because it awakens the perspective differences in the shared knowledge. Objective faith will change perspective based on the facts and statistics, whereas subjective faith will change perspective due to emotion. As an IB history student, high-level history student, there are always discussions on the reliability of personal knowledge. In many historical events, the public become bystanders and watch the events unfold. From a history standpoint, this is acceptable because if authority is usually involved and controls the public. In contrast to that is the ethical standpoint. For example, perpetrator versus bystander. Ethically, you should not put yourself in the situation of a bystander, but instead you should be the perpetrator if you have the option. Another question raised in history is, does time change our perspective? We can see our perspective has diluted due to memory and the idea that we make judgment using inferences at the time of decision making. This is because our judgment is bound to the standard of time in which it happened. So the first perspective I'll use is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is when you go from a broad statement and then apply it to a particular case. The process in which this happens is looking at the information, identifying a pattern with the information, creating a tentative hypothesis, and then forming a theory from that hypothesis. The use of deductive reasoning has a big effect on personal knowledge because the knowledge you gain from deductive reasoning is not new information or data. We're just using ideas and information we already possess. However, by combining them in the process of reasoning, we can draw conclusions we did not realise before. This means that new shared knowledge is stripped down so the knowledge you possess can be applied in this case. Therefore, it is easier to change your personal knowledge because you've already accepted the information used to come up with this conclusion. As I'm using reason, I'll use faith to support this. To go hand in hand with deductive reasoning, I'm using objective faith. Objective faith gives us factual understanding of the world and logical systems. It is based on solid evidence and deductive reasoning. Objective faith helps to form our personal knowledge because if we do not have objective faith in the shared knowledge provided being valid and true, then our perspective will change. However, one question is, how certain can you be that evidence is valid? The second perspective I'll use is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is going from a particular example to a broad generalization. The process in which this happens is making a theory, creating a hypothesis, making an observation, and then confirming the theory from observation. Is inductive reasoning reliable? Personal knowledge affected by inductive reasoning is mainly based on hasty generalizations, which is made worse by confirmation bias. This is when people tend to only remember evidence that supports their beliefs and ignore those that don't. This means that your initial personal knowledge becomes difficult to change. Also, the logical certainty of the inductive conclusion is entirely dependent upon the correct interpretation of the evidence and the consistency of the evidence. This links back to objective faith with the idea that you must have faith in the shared knowledge. This shows that personal knowledge could be invalid as the basis of an inductive conclusion comes from a broad generalization. Subjective faith. I'll also back this up with faith, however, it will be subjective. Subjective faith affects our personal knowledge when there is an emotional connection. Although subjective faith helps to form our personal knowledge because it gives us faith that our theory is correct, we must argue the amount of emotion which affects our personal knowledge. Is emotion influence personal knowledge valid and reliable? So a linking real life situation to this is the Chapecoense plane crash that happened recently. This was when almost the full Chapecoense soccer team died in a plane crash just outside Medellin, Colombia. And inductive reasoning has been used to create a theory, and the theory is that the plane malfunctioned, which causes an emotional response in the public. However, after new information was released that the pilot could have stopped the plane to refuel, this led to a change in opinion. This shows that as they have formed an emotional connection with the initial shared knowledge, this emotion has distorted the further shared knowledge, leading to an invalid personal knowledge. Inductive reasoning has its cons. For example, is inductive reasoning valid if it can't guarantee its conclusions? Does observation give us certain results? How far can you assume the uniformity of data? Major limitations with induction come from the relationship with the particular and the generalization. How many particulars does it take to make a good generalization? Karl Popper explored this with the idea of the black swan that was discovered. He was able to expose the problem of induction because a universal generalization can be falsified by just one single counterexample. Although it might be a positive that deductive reasoning is based solely on shared knowledge, it also becomes a negative because it means you're relying on the shared knowledge being pure and with no bias. This leads to the question of how reliable is personal knowledge in making decisions. Conclusion. Through the findings of this presentation, it can be argued that the freedom of knowledge allows for valid personal knowledge. However, depending on the faith and reasons used will decide the certainty of the personal knowledge. When exploring the question, we must explore the effect of emotion, as it is shown to have a factor on personal knowledge which distorts it, therefore becoming invalid. Someone who relies on subjective faith to validate information will disagree with this conclusion, as they are only using emotion to decide the validity of the shared knowledge. Therefore, their personal knowledge will have always been distorted. Thank you for listening.